Welcome, everybody. I am Emily Hinken-Ritter, and I'm Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Merced. And I am acting as the coordinator for online speaker series for the Peace Science Society International. And in this series, we are attempting to provide access to new and ongoing research all throughout the year, and not just at the annual conference. So in this effort, we are presenting all kinds of different peace science-related research in its early stages. And so what we're going to do today is have a presentation from Henry Pascoe, who is a graduate student, and he's on the job market and very exciting. And he is going to present some new research today on foreign aid and international institutions. And we will have discussion. We're joined by discussants today, and including Ben Fordham of Binghamton University. We have Burcu Savun, who is from Pitt. We have Carla Martinez Machain, who is from Kansas State University, and Matt DiGiuseppe from the University of Mississippi. And so I'm very grateful that all of you are here today and have read Henry's paper and can give him feedback. We're going to start with a presentation from Henry, which will provide background about the research project for anybody who hasn't read the paper. If you do want to read the paper, it's available on the Peace Science website under the Colloquium tab, so you can read the draft if you're interested in it. And we're going to take it away. So, Henry, if you want to share your slides with us.
All right. Thanks, Emily.
Sure.
So today I'm going to present a paper that's motivated by the fact that terrorist groups often base in weak states with limited ability to control actors in their territory. And this makes international cooperation for counterterrorism important for its prevention. States targeted by attacks may wish to form cooperative arrangements in which they subsidize states that are havens for terrorism with foreign aid, but often, due to misappropriation, these arrangements are limited. And my research is about how international agreements foster counterterrorism cooperation. Counterterrorism is also a challenging area to get strong international agreements. Indeed, those I will talk about today, the United Nations Conventions for the Suppression of Transnational Terrorism, do not have enforcement provisions nor delegated authority to an international organization. They only define certain acts as transnational terrorism and list requirements for what ratifying states must do to criminalize, prevent, and prosecute terrorist attacks on foreign targets. And this raises the research question I'll talk about today, which is, are international agreements successful at preventing transnational terrorism? And if so, why? Because these agreements could just be scraps of paper, and haven state governments may have incentives to shirk on keeping their nationals from attacking other states with no formal threat of punishment to deter them from doing so. My answer to this question is that these multilateral agreements operate via an informal, decentralized enforcement mechanism, foreign aid. Agreements improve the ability of donors to monitor counterterrorism efforts of recipients of foreign aid, which makes threats to withdraw aid more credible. These threats form a novel, informal enforcement mechanism, which produces counterterrorism cooperation. So today, I'll talk briefly about how the literature has thought about the problem of transnational terrorism, talk then some about how donors use foreign aid to address this problem and why it sometimes fails at that goal, and then I'll present the logic of the argument for my model in the paper about how agreements help mitigate these problems. And I'll conclude with quantitative tests of implications of the argument for patterns of transnational terrorism and foreign aid. A central question to the study of international agreements has been, why do international agreements work? Information has been suggested as one major way. However, why information is useful for fostering cooperation is unclear without reference to an enforcement mechanism to alter state behavior. If there are no consequences to noncompliance, why should states change what they are doing from their preferred policy, regardless of whether compliance is observable? So to address this, I draw on a growing body of research on foreign aid and international agreements. Many of these studies view aid as simply a side payment to encourage states to participate in or comply with agreements. However, there's a growing recognition that agreements may not only be side payments, or rather that aid may not only be a side payment, they may actually enhance the ability of states to comply with agreements. For instance, Uperlin and Basidi find that aid can provide a resource for states to draw upon to compensate domestic actors who lose out from economic reforms, which makes it easier for states to comply with preferential trade agreements. I go a step further to show that the threat of foreign aid withdrawal is an informal enforcement mechanism for agreements. So aid's not just a side payment here or a means of capacity building, but it's actually the basis for an enforcement mechanism for agreements. Scholars of transnational terrorism have been interested in whether foreign aid can help reduce terrorism, motivated by the fact that direct military intervention is also often very costly and unpopular and may not always be the best option. The findings here have been mixed in that aid might be helpful, but it faces problems because of recipient misappropriation. The implications of this project for the terrorism literature are that agreements can really matter. They can improve efforts to delegate the fight against terrorism by using foreign aid, but by providing benchmarks for donors to evaluate how aid is used. And in this way, this project connects to the literature on foreign aid and principal agent problems. And so I show that international agreements have a role to play in how effective foreign aid is at accomplishing its goals. Okay, so let me be a little more specific here about how states can prevent terrorist attacks against foreign targets from originating in their country. In broad strokes, investments may reduce terrorism in two ways. The first is by building opportunity. So the logic of this avenue is that by improving health, education, and reducing poverty for people in a state where terrorists are based, they are less likely to be sympathetic to terrorist activity, and the networks of support that terrorists depend upon are eroded. The second avenue is by bolstering state capacity, by passing domestic laws, policing, prosecution, as well as banking and corporate regulation. The idea here is that foreign aid may help augment state ability to control terrorist groups when invested by recipient governments in measures that either build opportunity or bolster state capacity. However, it said recipient country governments may prioritize counterterrorism differently than donors, and consequently, they may want to spend foreign aid on other things. So, very prominent examples here on the left, the jet that the president of Uganda used over 30 million pounds of UK foreign aid to purchase. And on the right are missiles that Pakistan purchases with US military aid intended for counterterrorism. Of course, missiles aren't useful for counterterrorism, but they are useful for arming against their rival, India. And so this misappropriation creates a dilemma for donors. The donor's dilemma is that on the one hand, if aid is being used correctly by recipients, withdrawing it will make transnational attacks from that country more severe and frequent. However, if aid is being misappropriated, they should withdraw it because it's a waste of limited resources that could be used more productively elsewhere. And this dilemma makes it difficult for donors to credibly threaten to withdraw aid. Next, I'll discuss how counterterrorism agreements help mitigate this dilemma. These are the 10 United Nations Counterterrorism Conventions. These are the agreements I'm talking about today. And they're in a variety of issue areas, including hijacking, kidnapping, bombing, and terrorist financing. However, one thing they share is that they each provide explicit requirements for states to control their nationals by taking specific measures, which I talk about as benchmarks. What's next? Here they are. So these are the benchmarks that each of these agreements lay out. And these include things like criminalizing certain terrorist activities by passing domestic laws and establishing severe penalties, preventive measures such as marking plastic explosives, regulating banking and policing, and also investigation and prosecution, so collection of evidence, prosecution, or extradition of perpetrators. An example, so for instance, the UN Terrorist Financing Convention requires that states pass domestic laws criminalizing the financing of transnational terrorism, that they implement banking regulations, and that they investigate and prosecute suspected terrorist financing. So my argument is that because these benchmarks are directly observable, they improve the ability of donors to monitor aid recipients. So the passage of a domestic law, whether you prosecute terrorists, and whether you regulate banks are each directly observable. And because they can't not be attained without significant investments in counterterrorism, they're not cheap talk. So it's by observing these costly to obtain benchmarks and whether they are met, donors better gauge counterterrorism investments by recipient states, which makes threats to withdraw aid more credible. And this threat of punishment that constrains misappropriation and makes foreign aid more effective as a counterterrorism tool. This argument has two implications that I'll test today. The first is that states that ratify international counterterrorism agreements should receive more aid than states that do not ratify. Donors are more optimistic that the aid will actually go to counterterrorism. The second hypothesis is that because misappropriation is constrained, foreign aid should be marginally more effective at reducing transnational terrorism in states that ratify these agreements. Okay. So to test the first hypothesis, collect data on ratification of these agreements between 1963 and 2008. Because there are many agreements and a changing number of agreements over time, I create an index of ratification. I call this the Treaty Capital Index. It's simply the total number of agreements ratified by country I time t, plus the worldwide average ratified at time t. And for robustness, I also use proportion ratified and total ratified as alternate measures. To measure foreign aid, I use the aid data recipient aggregates from state donors. So it's a histogram of the average aid receipts on the log scale. And for the test hypothesis 1, that ratification increases the amount of aid that a state gets, I use the dependent variable of the log foreign aid received, and the independent variable, like Treaty Capital Index, that measure of ratification, and a log linear fixed effects model. Control for a variety of things, happy to talk about during the discussion. And here's the results of that first test. So this is the marginal effect, moving from the mean amount of treaty capital, so that's being an average ratifier, to the 90th percentile, being an exceptional ratifier. And the point estimate here is a 200% increase in the amount of foreign aid received. Of course, that confidence interval is very wide, but it is a significant increase in the amount of foreign aid. And so this helps support hypothesis 1. Now we'll turn to hypothesis 2, which is that ratification of agreements should make foreign aid more effective at reducing attacks. So the dependent variable here is the number of transnational attacks perpetrated by a country's nationals. So this map shows this variable as the number of attacks by each country's nationals in my data set. And you can see there's wide cross-country variation, and there's also quite a lot of variation within country over time. So to test hypothesis 2, using the independent variable, which is interaction of treaty capital with foreign aid. Again,
2 minutes, Henry.
Thank you. Get at the expectation that states that have not ratified agreements, for those states, foreign aid should not have much of an effect. But as states ratify more agreements, the number of attacks should be reduced. Foreign aid should be more effective at reducing attacks. So here I use the fixed effects negative binomial model, and again, control for a variety of factors. So here are the results. That test has the marginal effect of foreign aid on terror event count on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis is treaty capital. So what we see here is that for low amounts of treaty capital, foreign aid actually is not that effective. It actually increases the number of attacks. But as states ratify, that's mitigated to the point where for states with treaty capital above 1 or 2, foreign aid actually reduces the amount of terror attacks. It's actually an effective instrument there. And so I think this is good kind of first cut evidence that these agreements are having a real effect on how effective foreign aid is as a counterterrorism policy. And so in conclusion, these agreements help improve the monitoring of recipients of foreign aid. And I think this project really shows how international agreements can make foreign aid more successful as a counterterrorism policy, not just as a side payment or as a capacity building mechanism, but actually as an informal enforcement mechanism that helps promote international counterterrorism cooperation.
Great. Thank you so much, Henry. And with that, I'll open it up for any comments that we might have from the discussants. I've got Ben, and then Carla, and then I think Burcu. Okay.
Well, thanks, Henry, for a really interesting presentation and a really nice paper. I thought one of my comments, I want to start out with a comment about the basic mechanism in the model, how it is that agreements make foreign aid more effective. And your argument is that it has a lot to do with transparency, but I found myself wondering as I was reading it how that actually works. So states have committed themselves to regulating banking in particular ways and engaging in policing and prosecution that are up to standards. But while you can observe to some extent whether or not this is happening, I'm wondering if, as a foreign aid donor, can you really tell if states are doing this or if they're just sort of going through the motions and rounding up the usual suspects and not taking the policing and regulating part of it very seriously. And you make a suggestion in your conclusion that I thought was really good and might be more important than you have in the paper at present, and that is that perhaps the agreements empower domestic actors inside the state who are in a position to monitor these activities a little more closely than a foreign aid donor might be able to do. So can you give me a little more elaborate sense of what the mechanism is that you had in mind? Maybe it's not the domestic actors.
So here, that's not my mechanism. I think that's interesting and something worth pursuing. The mechanism I had is simply that by observing these benchmarks, donors get marginally more information, so it's just a marginal improvement. There's still a partial observability problem. They don't learn everything they'd like to learn about how aid is being used, but they learn enough that threats to withdraw aid are made more credible. The domestic actor mechanism is an interesting one, and we'll explore that more.
Well, you do mention it in your conclusion, so I know it's something that you'd already thought about.
Yeah, I've been thinking about it, but yeah, I haven't systematically.
Mm-hmm.
Let me get Carla and then Burcu. Oh, Burcu has 2 points on that, 2 fingers. So let me do Burcu first.
Yeah, as Ben said, this is really an interesting, excellent paper. I really like the fact that, Henry, you are combining international institutions, international political economy, and conflict literature all together. My question, yeah, that is something, it's really neat. Related to Ben's comment, I was thinking about what is the independent role of the institutions or international agreements here. What are they like really contributing? Because these benchmarks can be directly observed by the donors, right? So if you give aid independently of the agreements and if you can observe it, what is the independent effect? I think that wasn't very clear for me in the paper. That can be actually clarified.
So the independent effect here that I have in mind is that just that the agreements establish a shared benchmark. So these multilateral agreements, really like all they're doing is establishing benchmark for all ratifying states. And so it gets out of things like, well, Colombia's in a peace process. Maybe we should relax, you know, some things about terrorist hostage taking to make the peace agreement more likely. Well, no, there's this multilateral agreement. They either ratify or not, so they kind of commit maybe more than they would in just bilateral negotiations.
So the assumption is that when the United States is giving money to Afghanistan, they cannot tell directly, okay, we want A, B, C from you. You're saying you need an international agreement to clarify that expectation. It can't be between donor and recipient communication.
Whether or not they can, I think probably depends on the bilateral relationship. But the nice thing about these agreements, since they're multilateral, is they have an established, kind of agreed upon benchmark that a lot of states have ratified already. And so, you know, by getting a state to ratify and commit to those benchmarks and then observing whether or not they meet them, donors can learn a lot about how counterterrorism investments are in that recipient state.
Could I follow up on Ben's? Is that I don't quite understand how they're learning that they meet them or not. How are they getting information about whether they meet those benchmarks or not? So, like, now that we've set the standards, what are those benchmarks? How are they being met?
Yeah. So the ones that are probably easiest to directly observe are things like passing a domestic law. Just simply observe whether or not that law gets passed. And one thing I'm working on now is a data set of benchmark achievement, kind of test more hypotheses about conditionality based on that. You know, for policing and prosecution, perhaps it's a little harder and noisier. Maybe those benchmarks aren't as informative. Another one that I think is informative and directly observable is banking regulation. So I think donors pay attention to whether certain types of banking regulation have been implemented in the country for concerns about terrorism and probably a variety of other reasons that foreign aid donors might worry about that.
I've got two fingers from Carla. And then Matt.
So actually, my original point was very similar to Burcu, so I'll just hop in on that as well. So again, I also I really enjoyed the paper, and I like this linkage of aid and terrorism. I had that similar concern of why wouldn't the donor state essentially just ask the recipient, do this, do that, right? Demand the same benchmarks, right, that the agreement does. In other words, what's the role of this third actor, the organization? I think you've already addressed that to some degree. Something else that popped into my head, and I don't know if this is something you thought about at all, Henry, is whether maybe it is easier for the recipient state to sell to its electorate this idea of engaging in counterterrorism if it's coming from the point of view of complying with an international agreement, as opposed to this big donor is bossing us around. Now, for example, the United States, they're telling us to do this. That might be politically more difficult to sell than complying with the UN. So I wonder if that was something that you thought about at all.
Yeah, I thought a little bit about this. I'm still trying to think of a good empirical strategy to get at whether or not that's going on. But you know, kind of haven't dug into discussions around counterterrorism policy in these countries to see if they reference that, or you know, how it changes those kind of political considerations. But I think that is plausible given you know what I've seen so far. Matt?
All right, can you hear me?
Yep.
I I share the same concerns with most of the panelists so far. Right, I'm concerned that the international institution does reduce the transaction costs in what's expected, but it's really not that hard to say to Afghanistan or any other country for that matter, right? We want you to do this and this. The donors are holding all the cards here. So I think Ben was onto something you brought up in the conclusion, that the domestic audience might be a significant factor here, but also the international audience might play another role as a reputational cost, right? That if you sign onto this treaty, especially when you're talking about the financing treaty and how that plays into international banking regulations, and that might influence your ability to attract donor, FDI, and other types of economic activity, right? That signing onto these things and breaking it might be a significant reputation cost. That might be another mechanism through which this is working, or an ability to signal type that you care about these things, and there are additional constraints placed on your ability to, on your willingness to follow through with these treaties. And breaking them might pose some additional costs. Additionally, in terms of framing, I'm not so sure, and there's a lot of other literature out there that demonstrates this, that you point to that suggests this is a problem, but I'm not so convinced, right? I tend to like the BDM and Smith selectorate theory approach to foreign aid, that we give foreign aid to get policy concessions, and we really sometimes don't really care how that money is spent, right? In some specific cases, this might be true with aid as capacity building, but it might just also be to keep these leaders in power, and however they want to use that money best might serve their best to know how that serves that purposes, right? So it's not about state capacity, but potentially keeping this leader in power instead of having another leader that might be more sympathetic to the opposition, potentially associated with the terrorists, is the real goal here, not state capacity building.
Let's do two fingers from Burcu, and then Henry can take it.
Yeah, this is particularly the case if these are terrorist safe havens and they're strategically important to donors. So if the recipient is a strategic partner, then the conditionality of aid goes down, right? So I agree with Matt that this is part of your model, the conditionality, but I kept thinking myself that, okay, I mean, these are countries that from perspective of the donors of the United States are important no matter what you do. You keep giving money. So I think this is something you might need to think about, whether this the conditionality stage, which is, by the way, not modeled. That is something I want to talk when we come to the empirical section of that is something you should take into account. If you're going with framing, I actually have a point I want to make about the framing. This is not, so I keep thinking, what's the dominant story here? Are you trying to tell us that international institutions or agreements are important in reducing terrorism, and aid is just an kind of an informal enforcement mechanism, or the paper is, how can we make aid effective? Let's use international agreements. So I was, with the framing, your research question is, are international agreements successful at preventing transnational terrorism, right? But when we look at your hypothesis, second hypothesis, it's about foreign aid is more effective if it is combined by an agreement. You see, so I keep going back and forth, which one is the main message there?
Henry, do you want to respond to Matt and Burcu, and then I've got Ben on the queue.
Yeah, I mean, so this is an area where conditionality is hard, definitely. The role I see these agreements having is providing information that makes it slightly less hard, and so that's why I get the results I do, that foreign aid, well, that states that ratify get more foreign aid, and that foreign aid is associated with a decrease in attacks. And so if it was just a kind of strategic aid allocation story, I'd be skeptical that I would get those results. But the point's well taken, and it's kind of been one of the things I've been working on in this project, and we'll continue to work on the empirical strategy. We'll talk about that later, but I agree, and so that's why I'm working on that benchmark achievement data set to test some of those hypotheses. And let's see, on the framing, yeah, so originally I framed the paper more as, does foreign aid reduce transnational terrorism? Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. how do we explain that? International agreements is how we explain that. I've moved toward more toward kind of a international cooperation frame, and really learning about international agreements based on studying this set of international agreements. And so maybe that explains some of the kind of dualism in the framing, and so that's helpful. Keep trying to iron that out.
Could you hang on just a minute? We're having a bit of technical difficulty, and we might need to restart. So hang on just a second. Sorry, guys, hang on.
You know how I might be able to rejoin the one in progress?
I don't, unless you have that up. Unless you could just like restart and. I can still see everybody. We can all see each other, right?
Yep.
Okay. We're just not super sure if we're still live.
Okay.
So hang on. Apologies if we are live and you're observing this malfunction. You can see? Okay. I think we're still live. Okay. All right. And I have
I think
Sorry,
you're muted, Emily.
Yeah, you're muted.
Emily, you're mute.
okay. Got me?
Yep, we got you now.
All right. Ben, and then I have Burcu.
I think Carla had a two-finger. Maybe.
Yeah.
Oh,
I just had a quick follow-up.
Okay, go ahead, Carla. Sorry about that.
Okay, sorry, this is just on that same topic that Burcu brought up about the strategic importance of the recipient, and this is something that I wrote it up in my comments. It's something I had to deal with in a paper about U.S. troops and their effects on human rights, and it's something you might want to take into account because it might be that that effect that you're finding of the agreements on effective counterterrorism might actually be greater for some states than others. So maybe you could do it, just for one country or for two. Just look at what are the strategically important countries and see if maybe this effect is smaller in those than it would be in others where, the donor can more credibly threaten to remove the aid, right? Something to think about.
Great idea. Thank you.
Okay, Ben.
Okay, well, I know we're going to move on soon to talk about the empirics and stuff like that, but before we do, I did have one other thought about the model. One of the interesting features of the model, well, puzzling really, is that in it the terrorists are not strategic actors, so nature is the one who plays the role of the terrorist here. And it occurred to me that, well, if the terrorists have a stake in disrupting the agreement between the donor and the recipient, I mean, so they observe this going on, and they could actually intervene in a strategic way to disrupt the agreement if they engage in more acts of terrorism after the aid program begins. So I wondered if what was your thought when you decided to exclude the terrorist as a strategic actor from the model? Maybe it was just that it was a necessary simplification and the model just can't be made to work with three actors, or maybe you have a rationale for why you're thinking about the action of terrorist groups in that way. But I was curious about what it was.
Yeah, so I have written down and done some analysis where terrorists are strategic, and you do get some spoiling strategies. What falls out of that, though, is that benchmarks become even more important because attacks themselves aren't that informative about counterterrorism investments. Since players anticipate that terrorists are doing this spoiling strategy, and so it really focuses. It causes the donor to really just focus on benchmarks. They learn less overall, and it's kind of a mess in terms of the arithmetic, and so that's why it's not in the paper. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you just may want to say a little more about that in the paper itself when you send it out, because it's a likely objection that reviewers might raise, and if you have a reason for it and you put it in the paper, maybe you can deflect that.
Thank you.
Burcu. Burcu, you're muted. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are we ready to move to the empirical section of the paper, or
is everybody cool with that?
Or okay.
Okay. We can always come back if you have something
Yeah.
to bring up. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
No. So when I look at your model, the timeline, there's ratification stage, aid stage, and the conditionality stage, right? When this is the conditionality stage is where the donor can sustain or reduce the aid depending on what the recipient country is doing. So I thought that in your estimation of the foreign aid allocation, you might want to have like terror attacks in the model, because these are endogenous, right? If your aid is conditional upon what the donor is doing, so which wasn't there. So is there a reason why you didn't include it, or?
There's not. I'll do that. That's a great idea.
I've got 2 from Carla, and then I've got Matt.
And just to follow up on that point, something else you might want to think about is receiving aid, and this goes back to that same just lagging the attacks as well, because could it be the case that receiving aid from certain states, right, for example, from major powers, military aid, that might make you more likely to be targeted by terrorist organizations? And I think that would be resolved by the same solution that Burcu proposes.
Thank you.
Matt.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the measure you put together for treaty capital just a little bit, and I have some concerns about it. I haven't seen this in the human rights literature, which is, I'm briefly familiar with how they explore the effect of treaties. But it seems to me there will be some big trend effects in here, right? Because there's not a high attrition rate, right? Once you join the treaty, very few drop off, right? For the most part. So over time, this is going to build up, and the effect is actually going to diminish to some extent. There are going to be some big time trends in here, and the variation is largely going to be driven by how many other states join the treaty, right, rather than at single periods when a state joins another one, right? And I don't really see you addressing that so much in the model, and the same concern would probably go for the count model as well, right? There should be a time effect here, since the sample is pretty, the scope of the sample, the temporal scope of the sample is pretty wide. So maybe year effects or some time trends might really be necessary here. Or an alternative approach would just to be look at single treaties, right? Which ones do you think are the most important? It seems like the post 9/11 era, this is when terrorism really becomes a concern for foreign aid, and that's when we really see the foreign aid following national security concerns over terrorism, and maybe shrinking the sample. We know the aid data, first of all, is much better for that later period anyway, and aid data has problems going back a little bit further in their coverage. So it might solve a bunch of problems you have there.
Ben wants in on this before Henry.
Oh, I had a thought about the treaty capital measure too, which I thought was it's a clever measure, which I really quite like. But one possible problem with it is that it might be proxying sort of general participation in international institutions more broadly than just those treaties. And that's something you might be able to fix by controlling for the number of overall IGO memberships that the state has, or something like that.
Henry, you want to respond, and then I have Burcu.
Yeah, I like the idea of shrinking the sample. So I've done some of that in my dissertation, and so some of this is just trying to boil all that down into an article. But yeah, maybe focusing on that later time period is a better idea. I've done some stuff on single treaties as well, and maybe that would be better. The challenge I kind of faced in doing that is getting it all into sort of one article. So any thoughts on that are appreciated if I end up going that route.
Burcu.
Yeah, so I have a question about your measure of aid that you're using in your estimation. You're looking at aggregate aid. and the model is about, or the examples you give about is mostly counterterrorism, like aid given to deal with terrorism. So, I mean, I understand the difficulty of like parsing out different forms of aid, but in this case, if you look at aggregate aid by donors, the punishment part of the model, or the whether conditionality part, a little bit falls apart, because you might be giving aid for economic development, right? And if the donor, for anything that if in that total aid, and if the recipient fulfills that part but doesn't really fulfill the counterterrorism part, why would you reduce aid? So because punishment is so big, kind of this conditionality, I think in this case, trying to look at a more like, you know, sector-specific aid given for fighting terrorism is really fundamental to your story.
Go ahead, Henry. I'm sorry, Matt, was that two fingers?
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, that's okay.
Okay. Yeah, I would just, one problem with using the aid data I would add on to that is that it doesn't include military aid at all, right? It's completely excluded from there. And I think a lot of the aid we see going for counterterrorism is actually going to be in the form of military aid. I'm not sure if there are any international data sets on military aid. I know, of course, the United States has really good coverage of that. That's probably where most of the action is anyway, right?
And I've got two fingers from Carla, if you don't mind, Henry.
Great.
Right. No, I think I've run into similar problems trying to find international data for military aid. I think you could convince your audience if you maybe just did it for the U.S.
Yeah.
Just as a robustness check, right? Run it, look for the U.S., breaking it down into military and development data, and say, look at holes in this case where it's easy to break it down. And again, if you can't find military aid broken down for other countries, because same as Matt, I don't know of any data sets that would break it down for other countries.
Go ahead, Matt. I mean, Henry.
Yeah, so I've run it on some other kinds of aid. So I've done U.S. military aid, and I get a similar result. So that's the good news. And so yeah, I'll include that in the paper. And I think breaking it up by sectors is a nice idea as well. I mean, especially because sort of credibility may vary by sector a lot. So I'll explore that.
I have an open queue. Okay, Matt, and then Ben, and then Burcu. Sorry.
At one point in the paper, I think you mentioned that most of this transnational terrorism, the states that are the home of the terrorists, right, don't really have a stake in the fight, right? That's where we have this principal agent problem. I'm wondering how true that is, right? How much of the transnational terrorism is coming from places that don't have any domestic terrorism problems of their own? And I can't think of that many examples in this day and age, right? We could think of Saudi Arabia previously, pre-9/11, but I think for the most part, in the era where all the action is here, or at least where I assume all the action is, most of these states have domestic problems of their own, right? The Colombia example, obviously, they have most of the kidnapping victims were Colombian, right? And I don't see that anywhere in your empirical strategy besides controlling for civil war, right? And there's a potential alternative explanation that states are signing on to these treaties because it provides them domestic clout to maybe get over any domestic opposition, to give them the tools to handle their own domestic terrorism problem, right? Or they might have issues with neighboring states harboring terrorists that are attacking them, right? And they might want to leverage these international conventions for those reasons. So that's all I have to say, sorry.
Okay. It's okay. Henry, you want to respond, or should we go to Ben?
Yeah, let's go to Ben. I think that's a great suggestion. I'll look into doing that.
Okay. Take it away. Oh, you're muted, Ben. Okay.
I think I'm unmuted now.
You're good. Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. My question goes back to the discussion earlier about the aid data. And one related issue is that your dependent variable in the aid model is the aggregate amount of total aid that the state receives. And what you're really trying to model is a relationship between a donor and the recipient. And I wonder if you'd thought at all about breaking that down into some dyadic setup where you're just looking at the donor and the specific recipient, and maybe if you include terrorist attacks in there, those could also be attacks on the donor, rather than aggregating it all together. That, I don't know how difficult that would be to do. And there's still the problem that it's mostly it's all development aid, really. That's what the aid data is reflecting. So unless you just went strictly to the United States, you'd be stuck with that. But have you thought about setting it up a little differently than what you do now?
Yeah, so in the dissertation I do have some dyadic models that I do. So yeah, I could think about including those in this paper instead, if that might be better. It is nice in those to be able to parse out attacks versus the donor versus attacks on other foreign nationals. Kind of interesting, but yeah, in this present paper I haven't included those.
Yeah, well, the thing is, potentially a good deal of the aid could be coming from states for whom transnational terrorism isn't really a big problem, and they may be giving aid that mostly has nothing to do with terrorism, and probably you'd get stronger results if you were just looking at states that cared a lot about terrorism and their aid rather than all states combined together.
I've got 2 fingers from Carla on that.
Sorry, can you hear me okay? I think my internet's acting funny. Okay,
no, fine, perfect.
Yes, and I think kind of following up on that, one of my comments was about, you cited one of Navin Bapat's papers, but there's another one, 2006, which I have listed on here, where he also looks at the stick side of the equation, right, where the potential target state could punish the host for terrorist attacks. And so that kind of gets back to Ben's point, right, where the relationship really becomes dyadic. If your terrorists attack me, I could come after you, sort of thing. So just something to think about.
Burcu. Burcu, we can't hear you. Thank you.
Okay. So, following on Carla's comment, I was thinking about the graph. You have the figure for your second hypothesis. The right side of the graph shows that aid is reducing the terror attacks if the average agreement signature is high. I was thinking it might be the case that the left side, where Navin Bapat's work is relevant, that might be more about general aid in general, and your story is about more counterterrorism aid, right? Because those stories are not very consistent. I mean, if Navin is telling one story and you're telling another story, maybe your story is more about counterterrorism aid and the other stories about general aid in general, because the countries, they want to be relevant, right? They want to keep receiving aid, so they will keep terrorism alive. But if the counterterrorism aid is not fungible, so that's different than just the aid in general. So that's something to think about, those, because you don't really spend much time on explaining the positive effect of aid. I think that really begs the question. My comment is also the instrument you use for the ratification. So what you look, I guess you look at the percentage of the adjacent countries who have ratified the treaty as an instrument for a country's ratification. Is that correct?
Variable models, yes. Correct.
Yes, instrumental variable. So that instrument, I mean, obviously, if the neighbor's behavior affects your behavior will affect the neighbor's behavior too, right? I know Beth Simmons used that measure, and but I think you should at least acknowledge that this instrument has some problems. That it's, again, if there's a diffusion, it goes both ways, from neighbors to you and from you to neighbor. I mean, I understand it's impossible to find a perfect instrument, but I think it will be good for the reviewer that you acknowledge the limitations of it.
Thank you.
I have an open queue. Matt, and then Ben. Oh, wait, Carla, is that you too? Okay. Matt, and then Ben.
Yes, I think one of the drawbacks of using the treaty instead of focusing on one convention, that it's really difficult to get at the selection mechanism, and the instrumental biology book tries to get at that. But you could do some pretty complex modeling. So actually, Emily's paper with Courtney Conrad and JOP has this really cool selection with the Convention Against Torture, I think, right, and political vulnerability.
Yep.
That might be a really cool method to try to adapt here to try to get at the selection effect a little better than the instrumental variable model.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Ben.
Okay. Yeah, well, you have the testable implications you draw of your model have to do right now with aid and terrorism, and I'm wondering if it has any testable implications, or if you could have an easy extension of it that had any testable implications about the ratification of agreements. It occurs to me that the kind of states who can reasonably expect to receive aid if they ratify a counterterrorism agreement, because suddenly they'll be trustworthy enough to merit this sort of aid, might be more likely to ratify agreements. So maybe states that get a lot of other kind of aid would be likely to go ahead and ratify the agreement in hope of bringing in some counterterrorism aid. Or maybe there are other implications of the model that have to do with ratification, and I wonder if you had thought about any of those.
Yeah, to respond to that a little. So ratification, states get more aid, they're more optimistic, but it also opens up states to more transparency. And so in the model, anyhow, what sometimes happens is there's this risk of ratifying, you get more aid for a while, but then you don't meet the benchmark, you have a lower amount of aid than before you even ratified. And so, there is kind of this riskiness of opening yourself up to transparency, which constrains this, kind of screening story you're talking about. And I mean, if that didn't happen somewhat, there'd of course be no screening at all because all states would ratify. On the empirical end of things, I've tried the instrumental variable approach and a few other things outside of the paper I sent around, but I'm still not completely satisfied, of course, with the empirical strategy there. So yeah, definitely suggestions on how to get at that. I appreciate it.
Carla?
Sorry.
There we go.
Got it. So speaking of transparency and ratification, something else that, and this might be a different project, not this paper, but it might be interesting to look at whether ratification actually increases your transparency, right? Because so much of your argument is based on the fact that these conventions allow you to be more transparent for the donor. I don't know of any work that actually shows that, so it might be something where you actually would want to show that transparency increases with ratification of these counterterrorism conventions.
Henry?
Oh, it's an interesting idea. How do you have ideas about how you would get at that empirically?
I mean, I know there are a couple of measures of just generally transparency out there. I think Bell and Merced and Clay and company have one. There's
also Rosendorf and Hollier.
And Rosendorf and Hollier.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I have some of those listed here in my references, and so they're based on either how much information you share with the World Bank. They also, I think the Bell and Merced one is about the New York Times and where their stories are reported from, something about openness to journalists, things like that. So, it might be something cool to look at.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Kind of the causal chain linking some of those measures, I would have to think about some, but that's an interesting idea. I'll look into that.
Yeah, and I listed them in my comments when I emailed them to you. They'll be there.
Anyone else? Matt?
Just have one more small point. I don't think anybody's mentioned this yet, but getting back to Burcu's original comment, 20 minutes ago about framing of the paper and whether it's about foreign aid or treaty capital, it might be smart to show the inverse interaction here, right, with the marginal effect of treaty capital across foreign aid, right? I think both are substantively interesting. And additionally, you might want to lay out the graphs a little more so we can have a better idea what the substantive effects are here. it's a little hard to capture with the log of foreign aid there.
Do we have any final comments from our discussants? Burcu.
Yeah, so I have a very small comment on, when I was reading the paper, looking at some of the figures, in one of the figures, figure 4, I think you show different countries, Philippines, Turkey, India, how their this capital index, yes, changes. But when I think about those countries, India or Turkey, I don't think about them as terrorist safe havens. They're strong countries, and you started the discussion that these are weak countries. And I don't think that figure helps you at all, actually. I wouldn't even include them. It distracts rather than helps. So just a small comment there.
Okay. Henry, would you like to take a few minutes to wrap up or say anything or respond in bulk?
Yeah, so first, thank you very much for these comments. I think they'll help as I keep working on this paper. Let's see. I think breaking out by sector and perhaps doing a dyadic analysis is a nice way forward. Also, looking at other measures or other ways of incorporating time trends is a nice idea. And so, yeah, I think definitely gained a lot through this discussion, and want to thank you all very much.
Excellent. Well, I would like to thank Henry for sharing your project with us today, and I would encourage anybody who is watching now or tuned in late or is watching after the fact to go to the beginning and check out the presentation that Henry gave at the beginning if you have any questions about the project, or you can go read it, and it's available on the Peace Science Society website under the Colloquium tab. And if you have comments and you're observing in internet land, that you could email Henry any thoughts that you might have about the project, and I'm sure he'd be super excited to see them. You can also comment on the YouTube page or the Google Plus page, and I would encourage Henry to go check that out once in a while and see if people have commented on the project. But thanks so much for presenting today, and thank you very much to our 4 discussants, Carla, Ben, Burcu, and Matt, for joining us today. I really appreciate y'all being here and taking the time to read the paper and to give feedback to Henry. So I think this was a great discussion. And thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. We have one on May
13th.
May 13th will be our final presentation in the OPSC for this semester, and William Wagstaff is the Bremer Award winner for the best graduate student presentation at the Peace Science Conference in the fall, and he will be presenting so that everybody can get a chance to see that award-winning presentation. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.